Welcome to our channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our spooky stories. The first thing you notice when you step into my new apartment is the smell of fresh paint. It's a mix of hope and novelty, a feeling that I'm about to write a new chapter in my life. What can I say? I've always dreamed of this moment. Having my own space, free from the rules and protection of my parents. I moved to Minnesota recently, right after turning 18, and the apartment I rented is located in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tree-lined streets and well-kept houses. It seems like the perfect setting to start my adult life. I remember how excited I was that morning. I spent the afternoon unpacking boxes, putting books on the shelf, and hanging my posters on the walls. Everything was perfect. The lights were on, the couch was in the right spot, and I already had a stock of pizza in the freezer. I sat down in the armchair I had chosen so carefully and looked around, soaking in the new sense of freedom. But that night was different. The sky was covered with heavy clouds, and a storm was approaching, with distant thunder and sporadic lightning casting an eerie glow in the sky. There was a weight in the air, as if the night was charged with something invisible and threatening. I was in the middle of a book when I heard a sound that seemed like a soft knock on the door. I paused my reading, thinking it was just the wind or maybe the house adjusting to the humid weather. But then, the knock came again, louder this time, almost as if it was a desperate plea. I got up and walked to the door, a chill running down my spine that I couldn't explain. I opened the door slowly, and what I saw froze me in place. There he was, a young man, his eyes wide and his face covered in blood. His clothes were bloodied and torn, and he was trembling with fear. The storm outside seemed like a joke compared to the chaos I was seeing at my doorstep. Please help me," he said, his voice a hoarse and desperate whisper. The situation was surreal. The young man seemed to be fleeing from something, and the expression on his face was a mix of desperation and hope, as if I was the last person in the world who could help him. He looked back at the dark street, and I could see the real fear in his eyes, as if he was running from a shadow that was about to reach the light. I hesitated. I was alone in a new apartment, and I had no idea what was happening or who these people were that he was fleeing from. Fear mingled with my own sense of insecurity in a new environment. What's happening?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel my own insecurity showing through. He looked at me with a mix of relief and panic. They're following me. They're going to catch me if I don't hide." I could hear the sounds of the storm outside, thunder echoing and rain starting to hit the windows. But there was something more in the night, something that seemed to grow closer with every passing moment. I knew I should close the door and maintain the safety of my apartment, but his expression, that genuine fear and the urgency in his eyes, made my heart race. And then, before I could decide, he took a step inside the apartment, pushing the door open with a palpable desperation. The air around him seemed charged with oppressive tension, as if the night itself was leaning in to listen to our conversation. I closed the door behind him, and for a moment, the world outside fell silent, as if the storm was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. But I knew that the storm outside was only the beginning, and something much darker was about to be revealed. The door was closed, and the sound of the storm outside seemed a bit more distant now, but the tension in the room was palpable, almost as if the air had grown heavier. The bloodied young man stood in the middle of the room, and I could see every little detail of the fear etched on his face. He leaned against the wall, his eyes still darting towards the window, as if expecting the two men chasing him to appear at any moment. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a beat that seemed to grow faster and more uneven. Who are these guys?" I asked, trying to stay calm, though my voice came out more tremulous than I wanted. The young man looked at me, and there was an urgency in his eyes that made me take a step back. It doesn't matter. They want to kill me." The simplicity of his words sent a shiver down my spine. I leaned against the door, trying to think of a solution, but all I could feel was the rising pressure of imminent danger. But why are they after you?" I continued, hoping that understanding the situation would help me find a way to handle it. He looked at me with a palpable desperation. They got into a fight with me at a bar. I tried to escape, but they found out where I was. I just need a place to hide, just for a little while." I started thinking about all the reasons why I shouldn't let this stranger into my apartment, but at the same time, I knew that sending him away could be even more dangerous. His words echoed in my mind, and I wondered if I was about to make a decision that would put my own life at risk. The silence in the room was interrupted only by the sound of rain hitting the windows, and the lightning occasionally flashing, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Each flash was like a constant reminder of the storm and the danger outside. Suddenly, he moved towards me, and I could see the wound on his forehead, the pain visible on his face. Please," he pleaded, his voice a desperate whisper. Hide me. They'll find me if I stay out here." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and stepped aside to give him space. All right," I said, even though I knew my words didn't reflect the growing panic inside me. You can stay here, but you have to be quiet and not make any noise." He nodded, and I led him to the couch. He sat down with a sigh, and I could see the tension in his muscles, as if he was always on the edge of a complete breakdown. They'll find you here," I said, trying to be as honest as possible. They might be close." The young man looked at me with wide, scared eyes. I know. I just needed a place to stay until they calm down. I have nowhere else to go." The sound of thunder was closer now, and each rumble made my heart leap. I sat in the chair opposite the couch, trying to watch the young man without seeming threatening. The silence between us was tense, filled with a fear I couldn't explain. Time seemed to drag, each second stretching into eternity. I got up and went to the window, peeking through the closed curtains, trying to see if there was any sign of the two men, but the night was impenetrable, an absolute darkness that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Suddenly, I heard a sound. A faint knock on the front door. My stomach churned, and I turned to see the young man looking at me with wide eyes. He looked paralyzed with fear, his breath quick and uneven. Is it them?" He whispered, his voice trembling. I approached the door, trying to listen more clearly. The knocking continued, but it was becoming more insistent. My heart was beating so fast that I thought I might hear the pounding in my own ears. Stay here," I whispered to the young man, moving towards the door. Don't make any noise." He nodded, and I slowly moved towards the door, my hand reaching for the doorknob. The knocking stopped for a moment, and I stood there, listening to the storm raging outside. My hand touched the doorknob, and before I could open the door, a cold sensation ran down my spine. I was about to face something I didn't fully understand, something that could change everything I thought I knew about safety and fear. With a deep breath, I slowly pulled the door open, and what was outside made me take a step back. The door was open, and the sound of the wind and rain outside was like a distant roar, a portent of what was to come. I stood there, looking into the darkness beyond the door, trying to grasp what exactly I was about to face. The bloodied young man was behind me, motionless and pale as a ghost. Suddenly, without warning, the young man made a frantic move. He lunged at me with desperate force, like a cornered animal. The action was so sudden that I barely had time to react. His eyes were filled with panic, and he threw himself at me, trying to push me aside. What are you doing?" I shouted, trying to dodge his attack, but he was already on top of me, his dirty, bloody hands pushing me away from the door. Adrenaline exploded in my system, and I managed to dodge to the side, but the impact threw me off balance. I fell to the floor, feeling a sharp pain in my side, and looked up to see the young man struggling with something or someone I couldn't see. He was fighting with shadows, trying to hold back the invisible force that seemed to be closing in on us. I struggled to my feet, trying to regain my composure, but the situation was spinning out of control. I looked around the room, desperate for something I could use to defend myself. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker, and the thunder outside became an oppressive drumbeat, warning of impending doom. I grabbed a heavy object from a nearby shelf, readying myself for whatever was about to come through that door. My hands trembled as I prepared for the worst, knowing that the darkness beyond the door was only a prelude to something far more terrifying. With a deep breath, I turned back to the door, ready to face whatever awaited us in the stormy night. The guy behind the couch was paralyzed, but I knew I couldn't wait for him. The decision fell on my shoulders like an overwhelming weight, and I moved to the hallway, where the shadow of the door seemed to stretch toward the unknown. With my heart pounding in my throat, I approached the apartment door and placed my hand on the doorknob. The force of the knocks outside was almost an echo of the storm, a harbinger of what was to come. Each knock on the door was a roar of the storm raging outside, a roar that seemed to say that things were about to get much worse. I knew there was no time to hesitate. My fingers trembled as I slowly turned the doorknob and then opened the door just a crack, enough to peek into the hallway. The sight I had was a blend of shadows and faint lights, the corridor's lamp flickering with the intensity of the lightning outside. I saw two figures, men with determined and unrelenting expressions, their shadows cast on the walls like monsters emerging from the storm. They were carrying tools, a crowbar and a hammer, prepared for the brutal task of breaking down the door. My heart nearly stopped at the sight, and I knew we had to act now, or we would be caught in the storm with nowhere to go. They're coming," I whispered, my voice filled with panic. Quick, hide." The guy began to move, his trembling hands searching for a safe place. I knew our only chance was to either confront the men somehow or find a way to escape. The thought of facing these two men, knowing how desperate and dangerous they seemed, was almost unbearable. I grabbed what I could, a small piece of wood I used to brace the door, and prepared for the last and most desperate battle. The feeling that the decisive moment was approaching was overwhelming, and I knew any mistake now could be fatal. With each passing second, the door trembled under the pressure of the knocks. The sound became a constant beat, a drum marking the rhythm of our fight for survival. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a new surge of force hit the door, and I knew the real fight was about to begin. The door was shaking under the force of the attacks. Each impact was a cruel and constant reminder that time was running out. I looked at the guy hiding behind the couch, his eyes wide and filled with terror, and I could see he was as desperate as I was. The sound of the knocks blended with the thunder outside, creating a terrifying symphony that made fear pulse with every beat of my heart. The door was about to give, and I knew we had to act before the entry was forced open. I looked around the apartment, trying to find something that could help, and then I noticed the small closet by the entrance, a simple piece of furniture meant for coats and shoes. I moved quickly to the closet, opened the door, and began pulling everything out, searching for something that could be used as a weapon or a shield. I grabbed a small toolbox and an old pair of sneakers, and as I did so, the sounds from outside grew more intense and threatening. "They're going to break down the door any minute," I whispered to the guy, my voice a mix of desperation and determination. We have to do something." The guy, still hiding behind the couch, looked at me with a panic so great it was almost visible in the air. What are we going to do?" He asked, his voice barely audible over the storm and the pounding on the door. I took the toolbox and held it as a possible means of defense, preparing for what was to come. With a tense look, I started thinking of the best way to confront those men, knowing that a simple battle of strength might be our only chance for survival. The knocks on the door grew stronger and more frequent, and I knew there wasn't much time before the door gave in completely. The sound of the tools outside being used against us was a constant threat, and the anticipation of an imminent confrontation became almost unbearable. With one last look at the guy, I approached the door, holding the toolbox firmly. The rain outside was now an impenetrable curtain of water, and the thunder seemed to match the rhythm of the knocks, a symphony of terror intensifying with every second. Then the impact on the door became even stronger, and I realized it was about to open. I positioned myself beside the door, trying to prepare for what would come next. The feeling of facing the unknown was overwhelming, and the fear was almost paralyzing. Suddenly, the door gave way under the force of the invaders and swung open with a deafening crash. The sight I had was a blend of shadows and lights, the door swaying on its hinges as the entrance to the apartment became a battlefield. The two men were there, their silhouettes massive and threatening, their eyes shining with a cold determination. One held a crowbar, and the other a hammer, tools that now seemed like weapons of a relentless assault. Get out of the way, kid!" The man with the crowbar shouted, his voice filled with a cold, calculated rage. They entered the apartment, their heavy, confident steps, and I knew the moment to act had arrived. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and I lifted the toolbox, ready to defend my life and the guy behind the couch. The man with the crowbar advanced toward me, and I prepared for the fight, trying to stay calm as fear and tension swirled into a fiery ball inside me. The initial shock of the confrontation was intense, and I tried to use the toolbox to block the attack, the impact of the crowbar against the box making my hand ache. The second man moved to the side, his cold, calculating eyes watching the scene. The hammer swung in his hand, ready to be used, and I knew that any mistake could be fatal. "Stay behind me!" I shouted to the guy, who was still hiding behind the couch, his breathing fast and ragged. "Get out of here and find a place to hide." The guy, terror etched on his face, began to crawl away, trying to find a safe hiding spot. I kept my focus on the two men, my mind racing with desperate plans and strategies. The man with the crowbar tried a stronger blow, and I dodged it with a quick move, almost holding my breath. The sound of the tools clashing was a thunderous roar of violence and desperation, a battle for survival. I realized I couldn't just defend myself, I had to attack. With a strength I didn't know I had, I struck the man with the crowbar in the leg, making him stumble. The man fell, his cry of surprise mixing with the roar of the thunder outside. But the battle was far from over. The second man advanced with the hammer, and I moved to avoid the impact, the tension in the air becoming almost a physical presence. Every move was a fight for life, and every second felt like an eternity. With a quick strike, I managed to knock the hammer out of the second man's hands, but he reacted with blind fury, and the confrontation turned into a whirlwind of movement and chaos. The sound of the struggle was a tumult of noise, and the feeling that each move could be the last was overwhelming. I fought with all my strength, and then, in a moment of luck, I managed to disarm the man with the hammer, throwing him against the wall. The impact was enough to make him retreat, and I took the opportunity to prepare for the next move. The first man was still on the ground, slowly getting up with a look of anger and pain. I knew I didn't have much time before they recovered and attacked again. "You have to get out of here," I shouted to the guy, seeing him still hidden, looking at me with a mix of fear and hope. "Go now." He hesitated for a moment, but then, with one last look at me, he ran for the exit, disappearing into the rainy night. The sound of the storm seemed to swallow the sound of his footsteps, and I was left alone with the two men, ready to face whatever came next. I turned to face the two men, fear and determination blending into a desperate embrace. The fight for survival was far from over, and I knew that every decision, every move, could be the difference between life and death. With one last look at the door, I prepared for the final confrontation, knowing that the fate of us all was about to be decided. The silence that followed the muffled cries of pain from the men was deafening. The rain outside beat against the windows like a curtain of water, and the sound of the thunder seemed now to be a distant echo of our struggle. I stood in the middle of the room, my body sweaty and exhausted, my hands trembling from adrenaline and fear. The man with the crowbar was on his knees, his face a mix of pain and rage. The man with the hammer was propped against the wall, his eyes filled with a relentless determination. Both were visibly injured, but still dangerous. "You can't run now, kid," the man with the crowbar grumbled, struggling to get up. "We're going to finish this here." I prepared for the next attack, my mind racing with possible strategies and moves. Fear was still present, but now it was a force that drove me, a fierce determination to survive at any cost. The man with the hammer advanced toward me, his face red with anger. I tried to dodge the blow, but the impact of the weapon against the floor almost knocked me off balance. The fight was far from over, and every second seemed to drag on, filled with tension and danger. "You're not getting out of here," the man with the hammer shouted, his voice filled with almost palpable hatred. I moved quickly, using the toolbox as an improvised shield. The clang of metal on metal was a harsh, violent sound, and I felt the weight of the battle on my shoulders, a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. While fighting the hammer, I noticed the man with the crowbar was slowly getting up, his dirty and injured hands searching for a weapon to join the fight. Time was running out, and I knew I had to find a way to turn the tide in our favor. That's when I heard a sound from the entrance of the apartment. The guy I had sent out was back, his eyes wide and his body trembling. He was holding something in his hand, a small lantern he had found in the storm. "I didn't know where to go," he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. "But I heard the screams and thought you might still need help." The sight of the lantern was a glimmer of hope, and I used the moment to regroup. I needed a distraction, something that could give me an advantage over the men who were now preparing for the next attack. With a shout, I charged at the man with the hammer, using the toolbox to block a blow and then pushing him to the side. The impact almost threw me off balance, but I managed to hold my position and force the man to retreat. The guy ran to the corner of the room and used the lantern to illuminate the scene, the faint light casting dancing shadows on the walls. The sight of the lantern made the men hesitate for a moment, their angry expressions mixed with uncertainty that I used to my advantage. "Get out of here and take the lantern with you," I shouted to the guy, trying to keep my focus on the fight. He hesitated, but the need to escape was evident, and he took the lantern and moved to the door. With one last look at me, he opened the door and ran into the storm, his silhouette disappearing into the darkness. The two men looked at me with a mix of fury and frustration, and I knew the final fight was about to begin. The man with the hammer advanced, and I managed to dodge the blow with a quick move. The clash of weapons and tools was a symphony of violence and desperation, and I fought with all my strength. With one final blow, I managed to knock down the man with the hammer, and he fell to the floor with a cry of pain. The man with the crowbar, seeing the situation becoming desperate, tried to get up to attack, but I was ready. It's now or never, I shouted to myself, fear and courage blending into a whirlwind of emotions. With one last effort, I moved in and disarmed the man with the crowbar, using the toolbox to deliver a decisive blow that sent him crashing to the ground. He tried to get up, but he was clearly injured and unable to continue the fight. I took a deep breath, exhaustion and relief mixing into an almost overwhelming sensation. The two men were now incapacitated, and I knew the battle was finally over. The silence that followed was heavy and laden, a pause after a storm of violence. I looked around the apartment, the scene of the confrontation, now a mix of chaos and destruction. Fear was still present, but the feeling of having survived a desperate fight was a victory I didn't know I could achieve. The door was open, and the rain still fell outside, the storm a constant reminder of the night that almost destroyed us. The guy had fled to the safety of the storm, and I knew he was out of danger, at least for now. With one last look at the two men on the floor, I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the pain and exhaustion accumulating. The apartment was quiet now, the sound of the rain and thunder outside a curtain that hid the reality of what had happened. I knew this night had changed everything for me. The struggle for survival had been brutal and relentless, and the price of survival was a weight I would carry forever. But for now I was alive, and that was what mattered. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of the storm, and I sat on the floor exhausted and relieved, waiting for the night to finally end. The fear and terror had passed, and dawn was just a few hours away, a sign that despite everything, I had survived the most terrifying night of my life.